but I'm confident that with the record that we've produced, with the approach that we've taken, which is a very no-nonsense, nitty-gritty, pay attention to details, be very thorough approach. I think we have quite frankly, a very good shot at winning, and I have faith that we will get a fair and impartial hearing before the federal court. And I think to a large extent, we are, and we have been in this case, very resilient, and you have to be. I mean, there are some cross-examination transcripts where I have probably had to spend close to an hour to get an answer. Mm-hmm. And it wears you out, right? It's the first time ever, and I'm frequently in the commercial list with big players trying to resolve multi-million-dollar litigation disputes, and I can tell you the government is way more resilient. Trying to get a straight answer, trying to get a sense of what's happening, why it happened, when it happened, and who was involved. It's a tough process, but I think like anything else, if you do your homework and you're prepared and you're willing to take difficult steps. I mean, we have brought so many interim motions to ensure that procedurally this moved in a way that we thought was fair and appropriate. It extracts a big sacrifice from you, and it's a very resource intensive process, but I'm very confident that the commitment we've made and the dedication we've made is going to yield a good result for us. Okay, well, that's very heartening to hear, because your story basically is that this is very difficult and it requires painstaking effort, but if you do it properly, it's still a fair game. And thank God for that. And so maybe I could ask you guys too, if you wouldn't mind, let's go to the funding side of this. How much has this action cost? And let's look at that two ways. There's the outright costs, right? So let's say the legal costs, but then there's also the costs in terms of time and involvement, because Sean, you and Carl must have been spending untold hours on this, I would think, on a daily basis. And so there's a huge personal cost there. So, Carl, let's, what's happening on the funding front? How much has this cost, and what has it cost you and Sean personally?
Well, I mean, actions like this are always going to cost, at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? That's the reality of it. And if you lose and suffer adverse costs awards, then worse again, So it's going to be an expensive action. However you try and do it, the cost of the cost of the work that a lawyer has to do is going to be in there. The cost of working with expert witnesses, and as the intensity of the case builds and more motions are submitted, then of course the cost builds. Now, anybody who's had the unfortunate pleasure of suing government in the past knows that one government tactic, in the same way as many larger aggressive litigants, is to try and drown the smaller guy in costs.
Okay, well, so we have an answer to one earlier question, which is, well, why don't more people stand up? And the answer to that is, well, because it's unbelievably expensive and it consumes your whole life. And so, first of all, that means most people literally cannot do it. They don't have the time, because they don't have the excess resources in some sense that allows for the time. I'm not suggesting you guys were sitting around on your laurels, but you at least had the financial acumen and resources to make something like this vaguely possible, and that would put you in a small percentage of people to begin with, and then you'd have to be willing to do it, and then you'd have to find the right lawyer, and then you'd have to be able to withstand 8 months of, and that's a lot, of trouble on the personal and the judicial and the cognitive front. So it's a very difficult undertaking. How have you funded it so far, and what's been the story on that front?
It's been a mix of two things. It's been a mix of personal funding and also some, helpful donors that have, offered to come forward. But the majority of it ultimately is, in our case, is going to be personal funding at this time. And I think the funding of these cases is a very interesting aspect in itself. And I think the structure of the organizations that do this work in Canada is something that's worth, discussing. From my perspective, I don't see that the freedoms guaranteed by the Charter should be political. But there seems to be a tendency that organizations perhaps more to the right of centre are left with the battle of fighting for them. And I find that curious because the loss of freedoms affects everybody in Canada, wherever you sit in the political spectrum. So we have in Canada a small group of organisations that take on this kind of work, and they rely on lots and lots of small donors, occasionally large donors, perhaps, Justin Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, Canadian Constitutional Foundation, and some recent new entrants, such as the Democracy Fund and so on and so forth. And indeed, we're putting together a charitable foundation, which will be up and running shortly, called the Institute for Freedom and Justice, which we're hoping to fund in slightly different way. So it can take on two issues, one being key areas of litigation in relation to this kind of constitutional challenge. And equally as importantly, and I think, is supporting people who want to provide additional education to Canadians regarding the freedoms that should be protected by the Charter in the first place. And few people know about the Charter and about the content of. And in fact, I'd say one more thing, Jordan, if I can. Yeah, we were talking about Section 1 earlier, and Bruce and I have had one or two conversations over time about this. And I've been fishing around from the start trying to find out where Section 1 even came from. And what I found was that it was very difficult to find anybody who knew. And I asked some people that you'd know. I mean, we asked Preston Manning, for example, and is really interested in this. And he said, that's a great question. I've no idea. I asked Brian Beckford. Brian and I have had some emails about this, and Brian doesn't really know where Section 1 comes from. It's there, but who wrote it, who drafted it, I don't know. Section 33, we know, has a connection to Peter Lougheed, but where does Section 1 come from? And I've been grubbing around trying to find out why. I've had people in the Parliamentary Library looking at this.
Suppose it was a concession to Quebec claims for sovereignty?
No, I don't think so. I think that's more. I mean, Section 33 is interesting because that was put forward, and from what I can see, connected with Peter Lougheed, and then Pierre Trudeau seemed to want a sunset clause in there, and that seemed to be the concession. But Section 33, as Sam will tell you, doesn't apply to mobility rights in the Charter. And but Section 1. The best I can think, and I can find out so far, is I think you have to look to the mid-1970s and possibly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is binding on Canada. But if you read that carefully, Section 1 could possibly be an attempt at a sweep-up clause to catch some of the issues that arise out of that document. And at the timing, 1982, that would seem to fit that some consideration after the ICCPR came in.
Well, that's a great mystery, the fact that the biggest set of possible restrictions on our most fundamental rights is based